The wind that swept through Zawirsy in January 1943 was not merely cold. It was the kind of cold that settled into bones, that turned breath into ice, that made every movement an act of defiance against nature itself. The town, like so many others scattered across occupied Poland, had learned to exist in a state of perpetual tension, a collective holding of breath that had lasted now for more than 3 years. The streets, once bustling with merchants and students, with the laughter of children and the warm glow of shop windows, had become corridors of silence, punctuated only by the sound of military boots and the rumble of German trucks. In the center of this frozen tableau stood the convent of St. Catherine, a structure that had witnessed centuries of prayer, of devotion, of quiet service to God and community. Built in the 16th century by Cistercian monks, its thick stone walls had weathered wars, plagues, and the slow erosion of time. The building itself was a fortress of faith, with narrow windows that let in precious little light, with corridors that echoed with footsteps, with a chapel whose vaulted ceiling seemed to reach toward heaven itself. But now, in the 4th year of occupation, the convent had become something else entirely. It was no longer just a place of prayer. It had become a way station, a temporary shelter for those caught in the machinery of the Third Reich's grand design. The nuns who lived there had learned to navigate a treacherous path between obedience to God and survival under the watchful eyes of their occupiers. Sister Maria Benedicta knelt in the chapel, her knees pressed against the cold stone floor, her hands folded in an attitude of prayer that had become as natural to her as breathing. She was 38 years old, though the war had aged her in ways that no mirror could fully capture. Her face, once soft and youthful, had taken on a quality of stillness, of deep contemplation that came from witnessing suffering beyond comprehension. She had been born in Bavaria, in a small village where her father had been a schoolteacher and her mother a seamstress. She had grown up surrounded by books, by music, by the quiet rhythms of rural German life. At 18, she had felt the call to religious life, a pull so strong that it had overridden every other consideration. Her parents had been proud, if somewhat bewildered. Her younger brother had cried at her departure. That had been 20 years ago. She had taken her vows at a convent in Munich, had spent years in prayer and service, had eventually been sent to Poland as part of a missionary effort to strengthen Catholic education in the East. She had arrived in Zawirsy in 1938, just 1 year before the world caught fire. Now, as she knelt in the frozen chapel, she prayed not with words, but with the entirety of her being. She prayed for the strength to continue. She prayed for the wisdom to know when to speak and when to remain silent. She prayed for the prisoners who passed through their doors, for the soldiers who guarded them, for a world that seemed to have forgotten the most basic truths of human dignity. The heavy wooden doors of the chapel creaked open, the sound amplified in the cavernous space. Mother Superior Hildegard entered, moving with the careful deliberation of someone who had learned that every action carried weight, that every decision could mean the difference between life and death. Hildegard was 72 years old, a woman who had lived through the First World War, through the chaos of the Weimar Republic, through the rise of National Socialism. Her face was a map of experience, deeply lined, her eyes sharp despite her age. She had been Mother Superior for 15 years, and in that time she had guided the convent through challenges that would have broken lesser leaders. "Sister Maria, we have visitors." Maria rose slowly, her joints stiff from the cold and from kneeling. She brushed dust from her black habit, straightened the white coif that framed her face. Visitors. The word had taken on new meanings during the occupation. It could mean wounded soldiers seeking medical care. It could mean Gestapo officers conducting inspections. It could mean refugees desperate for shelter. Each type of visitor brought its own dangers, its own moral calculations. How many? Hildegard's voice was carefully neutral, but Maria could hear the tension beneath it. A transport, the SS. They have prisoners, perhaps 30 or more. Some are too ill to continue their journey. They want us to house them overnight, to provide basic medical care. Maria felt her heart tighten, but she kept her face composed. She had learned over these years of occupation that emotion was a luxury they could not afford. Fear showed itself in the smallest ways. A tremor in the hand, a catch in the voice, a flicker in the eyes. And the SS, those black uniformed enforcers of Nazi ideology, they fed on fear like wolves on wounded prey. And if we refuse? The question hung in the air between them. Both women knew the answer. Refusal was not an option. Refusal meant the convent would be shut down, the nuns arrested on charges of sabotage or resistance. Refusal meant the sick and elderly they cared for would be turned out into the snow. Refusal meant death, perhaps not immediate, but certain nonetheless. Hildegard's silence confirmed what Maria already knew. I will prepare the East Wing. We have blankets, some medical supplies, water, a little bread. It will have to be enough. Hildegard reached out, her gnarled hand grasping Maria's arm with surprising strength. Be careful, child. These men, they do not see the world as we do. They have been taught to view certain people as less than human, as problems to be solved rather than souls to be saved. Do not provoke them. Do not challenge them. Survive. That is all we can do. Maria nodded, understanding the wisdom in Hildegard's words even as something within her rebelled against the idea of silent complicity. She pulled her heavy woolen shawl tighter around her shoulders and made her way across the courtyard. The courtyard itself was a study in contrasts. In summer it would have been beautiful, with its ancient oak tree providing shade, with flower beds tended by the nuns, with the gentle sound of water from the stone fountain. But now, in the dead of winter, it was a desolate expanse of packed snow and ice, the fountain frozen solid, the oak tree's bare branches reaching like skeletal fingers toward a gray sky. Maria's boots crunched through the snow as she walked toward the main gate. She could hear them before she saw them, the rumble of diesel engines, the harsh bark of German commands, the shuffle of many feet moving in exhausted unison. 3 military trucks came to a stop just outside the iron gate, their engines idling, exhaust fumes rising in gray clouds. The vehicles were standard Wehrmacht transport trucks, but the men who emerged from them wore the distinctive black uniforms of the SS, the silver death's head insignia gleaming on their caps. The back of the first truck opened with a metallic clang, and prisoners began to stumble out. Maria had seen prisoners before, had tended to those who passed through the convent on their way to labor camps or worse destinations. But each time the sight struck her with renewed horror. They were skeletons wrapped in skin, their striped uniforms hanging loose on frames that had been starved down to the bare minimum necessary for life. Their heads were shaved, their faces gaunt, their eyes holding that particular quality of emptiness that came from witnessing horrors beyond description. They moved slowly, mechanically, as though they had forgotten what it meant to move with purpose or will. Some stumbled as they climbed down from the trucks. Others had to be pulled or pushed. A few fell into the snow and lay there, too exhausted to rise. Maria counted them as they emerged. 32. 32 human beings reduced to this state. Behind them came the soldiers. There were perhaps 8 of them, young men mostly, carrying rifles with casual confidence, and at their head stood the officer in charge. Obersturmführer Heinrich Vogel was a man who embodied the Nazi ideal in almost every particular. He was tall, well over 6 feet, with the kind of athletic build that spoke of regular exercise and adequate nutrition. His features were sharp and aristocratic, high cheekbones, a strong jaw, piercing blue eyes that seemed to evaluate everything they saw. His uniform was immaculate, his boots polished to a mirror shine despite the mud and snow of the journey. He was 33 years old, though he carried himself with the authority of someone much older. He had joined the SS in 1935, drawn by the promise of serving something greater than himself, of being part of an elite brotherhood dedicated to protecting the German people and advancing the cause of National Socialism. He had risen through the ranks through a combination of competence, ruthlessness, and unwavering ideological commitment. He had served in Poland since 1939, first in the initial invasion, then in the occupation administration. He had overseen the establishment of ghettos, the organization of labor details, the transport of prisoners to camps in the East. He had done these things not with sadistic pleasure, but with the calm efficiency of a man who believed absolutely in the righteousness of his cause. You, none, are you in charge here? His voice was clipped, authoritative, with the accent of educated Berlin German. Maria stepped forward, keeping her hands folded in front of her in a gesture that was both humble and protective. I am Sister Maria Benedicta. Mother Superior Hildegard oversees the convent. How may we serve you, Herr Obersturmführer? The use of his title was deliberate. Maria had learned that small gestures of respect could sometimes defuse situations that might otherwise escalate into violence. Vogel's lips curved into something that might have been a smile, though it held no warmth, no genuine pleasure. Serve? An interesting choice of words, sister. You will house these prisoners tonight. Some of them are ill, too weak to continue the journey. If they die during the night, you will dispose of the bodies appropriately. If they recover sufficiently, we will collect them in the morning and continue to our destination. Is this understood? Maria's gaze shifted from Vogel to the prisoners. They stood in a ragged line, swaying slightly, their breath visible in the frozen air. Among them, one man caught her attention. He was older than most of the others, perhaps in his mid-40s, with a graying beard that had not been shaved in weeks. Unlike many of the others, his eyes had not yet lost their light. There was still intelligence there, still awareness, still something that resembled hope. His name, she would later learn, was David Lewandowski. He had been a professor of literature at Jagiellonian University in Krakow, one of the oldest and most prestigious institutions of learning in Central Europe. He had taught Goethe and Schiller, Shakespeare and Dante. He had published papers on romantic poetry, had guided dozens of students through their studies. That had been before the Germans came, before the university was shut down, its faculty arrested, before he had been sent to the Krakow ghetto, then to a labor camp, then onto this transport heading east to a destination he could only guess at. We will care for them. Maria's words were simple, but they carried a weight that made Vogel's eyes narrow slightly. He stepped closer, close enough that she could smell the tobacco on his breath, the leather of his uniform. Care for them? Sister, I think you misunderstand your role here. These are not guests. They are not patients in your hospital. They are prisoners of the Reich, property to be managed and disposed of as necessary. You will feed them if we authorize it. You will provide water and shelter because it serves our logistical needs. But you will not speak to them. You will not pray for them. You will not treat them as though they were human beings deserving of care or compassion. They are cargo. They are numbers. They are, in the final analysis, nothing. Do you understand me? The words were delivered with absolute conviction, with the certainty of someone who had been thoroughly indoctrinated into an ideology that divided humanity into those who mattered and those who did not. Maria met his gaze without flinching, without looking away. Her voice when she spoke was soft but carried clearly in the cold air. They are children of God. For a moment Vogel said nothing. Then he laughed, a sharp bark of sound that held no humor. God. How quaint, sister. How touchingly medieval. Tell me, where was your God when we conquered Poland in 4 weeks? Where was he when we crushed France? Where is he now as we reshape Europe according to our vision? Your God, if he exists at all, has clearly chosen sides, and it is not the side of these wretches. He gestured dismissively at the prisoners. Now, move them inside before they freeze to death out here. That would create unnecessary paperwork. I will inspect the quarters you have prepared to ensure they meet minimum security standards. Maria wanted to respond, wanted to challenge his words, but she remembered Hildegard's warning. Survive. That was the priority. She turned to the prisoners. Please follow me. We have prepared shelter for you. Her words were in Polish, a language she had learned during her years in the country. The prisoners looked up, surprise flickering across their faces. Many of them had not been addressed directly, had not been spoken to as human beings in weeks or months. Slowly they began to shuffle forward, following Maria through the gate and into the courtyard. The journey from the gate to the east wing was perhaps 200 meters, but for these men it might as well have been 200 kilometers. They moved with agonizing slowness, some supporting others who could barely walk. Two collapsed in the snow and had to be carried by their fellow prisoners, their bodies light as children despite being grown men. Behind them came the SS soldiers, rifles at the ready, watching for any sign of escape or resistance. But there was none. These men were far beyond such thoughts. They were focused entirely on the immediate, on taking the next step, on drawing the next breath, on surviving the next minute. The east wing of the convent had once been a dormitory for students at the Catholic school the nuns had operated before the war. Now it served whatever purpose necessity demanded. The long stone corridor was lined with narrow cots, perhaps 40 in all, with thin mattresses and threadbare blankets. It was cold, barely warmer than outside, but at least it offered shelter from the wind. The other nuns had been busy. Sister Agatha, elderly and nearly blind, had gathered every blanket she could find. Sister Teresa, young and frightened, had filled tin cups with water from the well. Sister Elizabeth, practical and efficient, had organized the limited medical supplies they possessed: bandages, a little iodine, some aspirin. The prisoners were directed to the cots. Most simply collapsed onto them, too exhausted for anything else. A few drank the water offered to them. One or two managed to eat small pieces of the dark bread that Sister Teresa distributed. Maria moved among them, her trained eye assessing their condition. She had no formal medical training, but years of caring for the sick had taught her to recognize the signs of serious illness. Several had high fevers, their faces flushed, their breathing labored. Pneumonia most likely, or typhus. Without proper medicine, they would likely die. Others bore the marks of violence: bruises, cuts, wounds that had been left to fester. One man had fingers that had clearly been broken and had healed crooked. Another had a suppurating wound on his leg that needed to be cleaned and dressed. She came to David Lewandowski, who sat on his cot with his back straight, his hands resting on his knees. Unlike many of the others, he was watching her, studying her with those intelligent eyes. "You are injured." It was not a question. Maria could see the bruises on his wrists where shackles had rubbed the skin raw, the cuts on his hands from forced labor. David's voice, when he spoke, was hoarse from disuse and dehydration, but the cultured accent was still evident. "Nothing serious. Others need your attention more than I do." Maria knelt beside his cot, examining his hands more closely. The cuts were deep, already showing signs of infection. These need to be cleaned. If infection sets in, you could lose your fingers. She reached for her small kit of medical supplies, but before she could begin, a voice cut through the room like a whip crack. "Step away from the prisoner, now." Maria turned. Vogel stood in the doorway, flanked by one of his men, a young corporal with nervous eyes. The corporal was Werner Schultz, 22 years old, from a small town in Saxony. He had been drafted into the Wehrmacht in 1941, had volunteered for the SS a year later, drawn by promises of better pay and prestige. "I said step away, sister." Maria rose slowly, deliberately, her movements calm despite the tension crackling in the air. "He is injured. I was tending to his wounds. It is what we do here. It is our calling." Vogel crossed the room in long strides, his boots echoing against the stone floor. He grabbed David by the collar of his striped uniform and hauled him to his feet with casual brutality. David's legs buckled, but he managed to stay upright, his eyes fixed on the floor in an attitude of submission that had been beaten into him over months of captivity. "This one? Injured? He looks perfectly functional to me." These creatures learn to exaggerate their ailments, to seek sympathy they do not deserve. He shoved David back onto the cot with enough force that the man nearly fell. Then Vogel turned his full attention to Maria, stepping close, using his height to intimidate. "Let me make something absolutely clear to you, sister. You do not touch these prisoners unless I authorize it. You do not speak to them unless it is necessary for their basic care. You do not offer them comfort or compassion. They are here because it is logistically convenient, nothing more. If I see you disobey these instructions again, I will have you arrested and charged with aiding enemies of the Reich. Do you understand me?" Maria looked up at him, this tall man in his black uniform. this embodiment of a system built on hatred and violence. She could see the certainty in his eyes, the absolute conviction that he was right, that his cause was just, that these prisoners were indeed less than human. And in that moment, she made a choice. Not a reckless choice, not a foolish one, but a choice born of deep conviction and careful thought. I understand that you are afraid. The room went absolutely silent. Even the prisoners, most of whom did not speak German, seemed to sense that something significant had just occurred. Vogel's face, which had been flushed with authority and anger, went pale. What did you say? His voice was quiet now, dangerous. Maria did not step back. She did not look away. I said that you are afraid. You are afraid that if you see these men as human beings, if you acknowledge their humanity, then you will have to acknowledge what you have become. You are afraid that all the certainty you have built your life upon might be nothing more than a lie, and so you cling to your ideology, to your orders, to your uniform, because without them, you would have to face the truth. Vogel's hand moved to his sidearm, his fingers curling around the grip of his Luger. Behind him, Corporal Schultz took a half-step forward, his own hand moving toward his rifle. The tension in the room was palpable, electric. Several of the prisoners had raised their heads, watching, waiting to see if this nun would be shot for her defiance. For a long moment no one moved, no one breathed. The only sound was the wind howling outside the stone walls. Then slowly, Vogel's hand fell away from his weapon. He took a step back, his face a mask of controlled fury. You are a fool, sister. A dangerous fool. But you are also, for the moment, useful. Keep these prisoners alive until morning. After that, they are no longer your concern. And if you speak to me like that again, I will personally ensure that you are sent to a camp where you can learn what true suffering means. He turned on his heel and strode from the room, Schultz hurrying to follow. The door slammed shut behind them, the sound echoing through the corridor. Maria remained standing for a moment, her heart pounding, adrenaline coursing through her system. Then slowly, she knelt beside David once more. Let me clean those wounds. Her hands were steady as she worked, cleaning the cuts with water and the precious little iodine they had, wrapping them in clean bandages. David watched her in silence, and when she finished, he spoke quietly. Why did you do that? You could have been killed. Maria met his eyes. Because it needed to be said. Because silence in the face of such evil is itself a form of collaboration. You are very brave. Maria shook her head. No, I am simply doing what must be done. Bravery would be if I had a choice. She moved on to the next prisoner, and the next, working through the night while the SS guards stood watch at the doors and Vogel paced in the courtyard outside, his mind churning with thoughts he could not fully articulate. The night stretched on, cold and dark. Some prisoners slept, exhausted beyond endurance. Others lay awake, their minds too full of trauma and fear to rest. Maria and the other nuns moved among them like ghosts, offering what little comfort they could. In one corner, a young man, barely 20, began to cough. It was a wet, rattling sound that spoke of fluid in the lungs, of infection deep and serious. Maria hurried to his side. His name was Jacob, and he had been a student, studying medicine in Warsaw before the war. The irony was not lost on either of them. His face was pale, slick with fever sweat. His breathing came in shallow gasps. Pneumonia, advanced. Without antibiotics, without proper medical care, he would not survive more than a day or two. Sister Teresa appeared at Maria's side, her young face creased with worry. What can we do? Maria's jaw tightened. There was nothing they could do. Not really. But she refused to accept that. Stay with him. Keep him warm. I will speak to the guards. She stood and walked toward the door where Corporal Werner Schultz stood guard. He straightened as she approached, his rifle held across his chest in a defensive posture. Please. That young man, he is very ill. He needs a doctor, proper medicine. He will die without help. Schultz shifted uncomfortably. Unlike Vogel, he had not yet fully absorbed the ideology that allowed one to view human suffering with complete indifference. He was young, barely more than a boy himself, and some part of him still remembered his mother's teachings about compassion and mercy. "I cannot help. I have my orders. He will die." Schultz's voice dropped to almost a whisper. "Then he dies. I am sorry, sister, but that is how it is. I cannot disobey orders." Maria studied his face, seeing the conflict there, the remnants of a conscience not yet fully suppressed. "You have a mother, yes? A family back home?" Schultz nodded, confused by the question, in Saxony. "My mother, 2 younger sisters. Would you want someone to show them mercy if they were in his place? If they were the ones suffering, would you want someone to help them, even if it meant breaking the rules?" Schultz looked away, unable to meet her eyes. "It is not the same. It is exactly the same. Suffering is suffering. A mother's grief is a mother's grief, whether she is German or Polish or Jewish. The uniform you wear, the ideology you serve, these things do not change the fundamental truth of human pain." Before Schultz could respond, the door opened and Vogel entered. He had not slept. His uniform was still immaculate, but there were dark circles under his eyes and something in his expression had changed. The absolute certainty that had characterized him earlier seemed to have developed small cracks. "What is happening here?" His voice was tired rather than angry. Maria turned to face him. "One of the prisoners is dying. He has pneumonia. He needs medical attention that we cannot provide." Vogel walked slowly across the room to where Jakob lay. His breathing labored, his eyes closed. He looked down at the young man for a long moment. "Then let him die. We leave in 1 hour. Those who can walk will walk. Those who cannot will be left behind. He cannot be moved in his condition. The journey will kill him." Vogel's voice was flat. "That is not my problem, sister. My orders are to deliver these prisoners to the labor camp at Auschwitz. If some die along the way, that is simply the cost of transport." Maria felt anger rising in her chest, hot and fierce. She had been patient. She had been diplomatic. She had tried to work within the system, but there were limits to what silence could accomplish. "It is your problem. You brought them here. You made them your responsibility. You cannot simply wash your hands of their suffering." Vogel turned to her, and for the first time she saw something other than certainty in his eyes. She saw doubt, confusion, the beginning of something that might in time become understanding. "I made them nothing. They are nothing. That is what I have been taught. That is what I believe." And then, in the cold light of that winter dawn, with the dying young man's labored breathing filling the silence, Sister Maria Benedicta did something that would echo through the years, that would haunt Heinrich Vogel for the rest of his life, that would become a story told and retold by those who survived. She turned away from Vogel. She walked to the center of the room to where the prisoners lay on their cots, broken and exhausted, and she looked at them, not with pity, though she felt pity, not with sorrow, though she felt sorrow, but with something deeper, something more fundamental. She looked at them with peace, with recognition, with an unshakable belief in their inherent worth and dignity. And then she spoke, her voice clear and calm, carrying to every corner of that stone hall. "You are not animals." The words hung in the air like a benediction. The prisoners looked up, disbelief and hope warring on their faces. Some began to weep, tears cutting tracks through the grime on their cheeks. Others simply stared, as though they had forgotten what it felt like to be addressed as human beings. David Lewandowski sat up straighter, his eyes bright. Others followed his example, finding in themselves reserves of dignity they had thought long exhausted. Maria continued, her voice gaining strength. "You are not cargo. You are not numbers. You are men. You are human beings, created in the image of God, deserving of dignity and respect and compassion. And no order, no uniform, no ideology, no matter how powerful or pervasive, can change that fundamental truth." Vogel's face had gone white. He stepped forward, his hand once again moving toward his sidearm. "What did you say? What did you dare to say?" Maria turned to face him, and in her eyes, he saw something that terrified him more than any enemy soldier, more than any battlefield danger. He saw absolute moral certainty. He saw a conviction deeper than his own, rooted in something he could not understand or combat. "I said they are not animals. They are human. They are your brothers, Herr Vogel, whether you acknowledge it or not. They feel pain as you do. They hope as you do. They love and fear and dream as you do. And when you treat them as less than human, you do not diminish them. You diminish yourself." Vogel's hand trembled on his weapon. Behind him, Schultz stood frozen, his face a mask of confusion and dawning horror as he confronted, perhaps for the first time, the true implications of what he had been doing. For a long moment, it seemed that Vogel might draw his weapon, might shoot this defiant nun and be done with it. But something stopped him. Perhaps it was the way she looked at him, without fear or hatred. Perhaps it was the way the prisoners had responded to her words, sitting straighter, looking at him not with the blank submission he was accustomed to, but with something that resembled hope. Or perhaps it was something deeper, some crack in the armor of his certainty that her words had widened into a chasm he could no longer ignore. He looked at the prisoners, really looked at them, perhaps for the first time since he had joined the SS. He saw David Lewandowski, sitting with the dignity of the scholar he had been. He saw Jakob, dying of pneumonia, his face young and afraid. He saw the others, 32 human beings, each with their own story, their own history, their own irreplaceable individuality. And for just a moment Heinrich Vogel saw them as human. The realization hit him like a physical blow. His hand fell away from his weapon. His shoulders sagged slightly. When he spoke, his voice was quiet, almost uncertain. 1 hour, then we leave. He turned and walked from the room, his footsteps echoing. Schultz hesitated, looking between Maria and the prisoners, then followed his superior officer, his mind reeling. The prisoners did not speak. But something had changed in that room, something fundamental and irreversible. They sat a little straighter. They breathed a little easier. They looked at each other and saw reflected back not the degradation they had been told defined them, but the humanity that could not be taken away. Maria knelt beside Jakob and took his hand. She prayed, her lips moving silently, and though he was barely conscious, he seemed to sense her presence, to draw some comfort from it. When the trucks came an hour later, the prisoners were loaded back into the cargo holds. Jakob was carried out on a stretcher, still alive, but barely. Vogel did not enter the convent again. He stood by his vehicle, staring at the stone walls, his mind a storm of doubt and questions he had never allowed himself to ask before. Schultz approached him hesitantly. "Sir, are you all right?" Vogel did not answer immediately. When he did, his voice was distant. "Tell me, Schultz, do you believe what we have been taught? About the inferior races? About the necessity of what we do?" Schultz was taken aback by the question. He had never heard his superior officer express doubt before. I believe in following orders, sir. I believe in serving the fatherland. That is not what I asked." Schultz was silent, unable or unwilling to answer. Vogel climbed into his vehicle and gave the order to move out. As the convoy pulled away, Maria stood at the gate, watching them disappear into the gray morning. Mother Superior Hildegard joined her face lined with worry and something that might have been pride. "What have you done, child?" Maria's voice was soft. "I told the truth. The truth will get you killed." Maria turned to look at the elderly nun, and a small, sad smile crossed her face. "Then I will die telling it. But I will not die silent. I will not let them make me complicit in their evil through my silence." Hildegard said nothing more, but she reached out and squeezed Maria's hand, a gesture of solidarity and understanding. The convent continued its work. Days turned into weeks, weeks into months. The war ground on, its machinery of death and destruction consuming millions. But in that small convent in occupied Poland, something had shifted. The nuns had remembered that bearing witness, speaking truth, affirming human dignity in the face of systematic dehumanization. These were not small acts. They were revolutionary acts. Heinrich Vogel completed his assignment, delivering his prisoners to Auschwitz. But he was never the same. The certainty that had guided him, that had made his work possible, was gone. In its place was doubt, guilt, a gnawing sense that he had been part of something monstrous. He began to make mistakes. Small ones at first, hesitating when he should have acted, looking away when he should have watched, allowing small mercies that his superiors deemed inappropriate. Within 3 months he was deemed unreliable and reassigned to administrative duties far from the front lines. He survived the war, but barely. In the chaos of Germany's collapse, he disappeared from official records. Some said he changed his name, fled to South America. Others claimed he was captured by the Soviets and died in a prison camp. The truth was lost in the rubble of a shattered Reich. Werner Schultz also survived. He returned to Saxony, to his mother and sisters. He married, had children, lived a quiet life as a school teacher. But he never forgot that night in the convent. In his later years, he gave testimony to historians, describing what he had witnessed, the words the nun had spoken, the way those words had changed something fundamental in how he saw the world. David Lewandowski did not survive. He died in Auschwitz 6 months later, his body finally giving out under the brutal conditions of the camp. But before he died, he told the story to others. And they told it to others, and it spread. A quiet act of defiance, a reminder that even in the darkest places, even in the heart of mechanized death, humanity could not be fully extinguished. Sister Maria Benedicta continued her work until the war's end. In 1944, the Gestapo came for her, acting on reports that she had been sheltering Jewish refugees. She was arrested, interrogated, and sent to Ravensbrück concentration camp. She survived barely. When the camp was liberated in April 1945, she weighed less than 80 pounds, her body ravaged by starvation and disease. But she survived, and when asked about her experiences, about why she had taken the risks she had taken, she gave a simple answer. I did what any Christian should do. I saw Christ in the faces of the suffering, and I could not turn away. She lived until 1982, dying quietly in a convent in Bavaria at the age of 77. She never sought recognition for what she had done. She never wrote a memoir or gave extensive interviews. She simply lived her life in service to God and to her fellow human beings. But her story survived. It was recorded in the testimonies of those who had been there, in the scattered documents that historians pieced together decades later, in the memories of survivors who never forgot the nun who had looked at them with peace and declared their humanity when the world had tried to strip it away. Years after the war, when researchers began interviewing survivors, one phrase appeared again and again in their testimonies. Prisoners who had passed through that convent, who had heard Sister Maria's words, they remembered. They told their children and grandchildren. They made sure the story was not forgotten. You are not animals. 4 simple words. But in the context of a system built on dehumanization, in a world that had industrialized murder and made cruelty a matter of policy, those 4 words were revolutionary. They were a refusal to accept the fundamental premise of Nazi ideology. They were an affirmation of human dignity in the face of systematic degradation. Today, if you visit Zawirsy, you can still see the convent of St. Catherine. The building has been restored, the damage of war repaired. It serves now as a museum and memorial, dedicated to those who resisted the darkness in whatever ways they could. In the chapel, lit by candles and the soft light filtering through stained glass windows, there is a plaque. It bears no names respecting the humility of those it commemorates. Instead, it carries a simple inscription in Polish, German, and English, in memory of those who chose mercy when the world demanded cruelty, in memory of those who saw humanity when others saw only enemies, in memory of the light that darkness could not overcome. And if you stand in that chapel, in the silence broken only by the whisper of wind through ancient stone, you can almost hear it, the voice of a nun, calm and unwavering, speaking words that refused to be forgotten, that echoed through the years, that reminded the world of a truth it had almost lost. You are not animals. You are human. You are seen. You are known. You are loved. That is the story. Not of grand battles or political maneuvering, but of a moment when one person chose peace over fear, compassion over ideology, truth over the safety of silence. And in that choice, she reminded the world of something essential, something that no amount of propaganda or violence could fully erase, that humanity, once recognized and affirmed, cannot be undone. That dignity, once acknowledged, cannot be taken back. That love, even in the darkest night, is stronger than hate. The trucks rolled on through occupied Poland, carrying their human cargo toward destinations of suffering and death. The war raged on, consuming millions in its insatiable appetite for destruction. But in that frozen convent, on that winter morning in 1943, something shifted. A crack appeared in the wall of certainty. A seed was planted in soil that seemed barren. And though it would take years to grow, though many would never see its fruit, it grew nonetheless. Because the truth, once spoken, cannot be unspoken. Because peace, once offered, cannot be taken back. Because humanity, once affirmed, cannot be denied. That is the power of a single moment. That is the legacy of Sister Maria Benedicta. That is the story of the nun who looked at the condemned and saw not animals, but children of God. And in seeing them, in speaking that truth aloud, she changed everything. For Heinrich Vogel, who lived the rest of his life haunted by doubt. For Werner Schultz, who carried the memory into a different kind of life. For David Lewandowski and the others, who found in her words a final affirmation of their worth before the darkness claimed them. For all those who heard the story and passed it on, keeping alive the flame of resistance and hope. The story ends where it began, in a small convent in occupied Poland, in the depths of winter, in the heart of darkness. But it ends not with despair, but with a truth that could not be suppressed, that every human being, no matter how degraded by circumstances, no matter how dehumanized by ideology, carries within them an irreducible dignity that demands recognition and respect. You are not animals. 4 words, a lifetime of meaning, a legacy that endures.